April 3rd, 1912. Though the weather started out clear for the beginning of Titanic's journey to her first port of call, her first night saw a thick fog develop at 2 a.m. that would not dissipate until after 6 in the morning. Despite passing her sea trials with flying colors, Titanic's builders wasted no time on her trip south and carried out further tests throughout the day. Various electrical equipment was tested, the sanitary conditions on board were inspected, and her officers finally got to see how their ship and her equipment behaved when properly at sea for the first time. The ship's engines were also put to the test. Throughout the delivery trip, Titanic maintained an average speed of 18 knots, briefly achieving 20 knots for short periods. However, Harlan Wolff naval architect Edward Wilding would report that the ship reached and maintained a speed of about 23¼ knots for several hours, the fastest speed Titanic would ever attain. Meanwhile, wireless operators Jack Phillips and Harold Bride were busy sending away messages to Liverpool, updating White Star and Bruce Ismay about the trials and the liner's progress down the Irish Sea. Titanic's wireless was the most powerful set afloat, with a range of hundreds of miles, but as she rounded Land's End at noon and steamed east, the perfect weather conditions enabled her to establish contact with Tenerife in the Canary Islands, as well as Port Said, over 2,000 miles away in Egypt. At the same time, Titanic's older sister Olympic was departing from Southampton on her 10th voyage from Berth 44, the slip which Titanic herself would occupy only a matter of hours later. At approximately 7:50 p.m., following Olympic's stop in Cherbourg, France, the two sisters would pass each other. At a distance of 23 miles apart, the liners were out of sight of each other, but it's possible that their eagle-eyed lookouts might have spotted their bright masthead lights peeking just over the edge of the horizon. Though they couldn't see each other, they were able to communicate through their Marconi installations, as Olympic's operators sent a few messages to their younger sister, likely well wishes to Captain Smith and to their counterparts aboard Titanic. At 9 p.m., Titanic was sighted off the Isle of Wight, her short first voyage nearing its end. Before making her way up Southampton via the Solent, Titanic stopped to pick up her pilot. She had arrived at the perfect time to catch the midnight high tide, and as she neared the White Star dock, 5 tugs came out to meet her with tow lines to turn her and guide her stern first into the dock. A complicated maneuver, but it was carried out perfectly and would save time when departure time came, as such a maneuver was much riskier during low tide. Finally, at 1:15 a.m. on April 4th, 1912, Titanic was tied up alongside Berth 44. There were 6 days left to prepare the ship for her maiden voyage. On the morning of April 4th, the people of Southampton woke up to quite the view. Towering over her fellow steamers and dressed in flags from stem to stern, Titanic was truly a sight to behold. Photographers and sightseers flocked to the docks to see the new ship. However, there would be no opportunity for a large public inspection that was afforded her sister ship, Olympic. There was too much work that remained to be done aboard, and there was no time to waste. Only one photographer would be permitted aboard, but he was restricted to the upper decks. Within hours of her arrival, postcards of the ship were published and on the market. Among those purchasing copies to send back home was one of Titanic's own, Second Officer David Blair. The postcard would be a bittersweet memento, for upon Titanic's arrival in Southampton, Blair and his fellow officers received the news that there'd be a late reshuffling of the ship's senior officers. When Olympic departed the previous day, her chief officer, Henry Wilde, remained behind. Wilde had been due to receive a command of his own, but the recent coal strike had laid up his ship, and White Star decided that his experience aboard Olympic would make him ideal to fill the same role on Titanic, for at least a few voyages. This meant Titanic's chief officer, William Murdoch, would assume his previous Olympic rank as first officer, while Charles Lightoller would become second officer, and David Blair would have to leave the ship he'd grown to love over the past few days. But as the reassignment had yet to be finalized, Blair was still acting second officer. After spending the day at home, Blair boarded Titanic for his nighttime watch and continued to serve as second officer for the remainder of the ship's time in Southampton, all the while looking forward to the day he'd be able to join and sail on the ship again as one of her senior officers. The process of loading coal into Titanic's bunkers had begun first thing in the morning, with the ship being moved out from the dock to allow coal barges to tie up on both sides. She'd brought over 1,880 tons from Belfast, but another 4,000 tons were needed. During her week-long stay in port, she'd burn up to 415 tons to produce steam and electricity for her winches and cargo cranes, as well as to provide light and heating for her crew while they worked on getting her finished. The ongoing coal strike meant many ships had to cancel their sailings. The ones belonging to IMM and White Star gave up their own supplies of coal to ensure Titanic had enough for her maiden voyage. One of these ships was White Star's aging Majestic. Built in 1890, she and her older sister, Titanic, were once considered amongst the largest ships in the world, and were the last White Star liners to capture the Blue Riband. But after 22 years in service, she was now an old relic. Since 1907, she sailed the Southampton, New York route, but declining passenger numbers caused her to be laid up, only being used as a reserve in case another ship in the fleet needed a replacement for a voyage unexpectedly. Her days were already numbered, but Titanic's arrival would seal her fate, and she'd no doubt be bound for the scrapyard soon. The first items of cargo also began making their way to the docks. Cases full of wool, cotton, ostrich feathers, hundreds of rolls of linoleum, the same material used throughout Titanic herself, books, artwork, cameras, and reels of film were lifted up by the giant dockside cranes and lowered down to Titanic's holds, where they'd be tightly fastened and secured for the coming voyage. Meanwhile, the work continued on Titanic herself. While Harlan and Wolff had delivered Titanic, the ship, much of her fittings and supplies fell to White Star to provide. Among the items brought aboard at Southampton, they included hundreds of deck chairs for her promenades, equipment and nets for deck games such as shuffleboard and deck tennis, books for her libraries, White Star Line stationery and pens for her writing desks, balls and rackets for the squash court, toilet paper, bath mats, beddings and linens for the staterooms and cabins, fine china, silverware and cutlery for the dining saloons, cafes, and restaurants, medicine and surgical instruments for her hospitals. The list goes on and on. On top of this, many fittings were still waiting to be installed. Carpets had yet to be laid everywhere. Their leftover trimmings had been taken home as souvenirs, and the smell of fresh paint and wood emanated throughout the ship. Brand new ships rust quickly, so painter's scaffolding could be seen in plenty of areas around the hull as her crew touched up her with fresh paints of black and white paint. The funnels would need a touch as well, but this was saved for the final days in port to ensure they looked as fresh as possible.